So to come to our nice session, I think every one of us knows that conserving nature to hold the tremendous biodiversity losses is a key challenge of our millennium. We talk about the planetary boundaries, about safe operating space for humanities, and we know without nature we will not have any chance to come back to a situation which is less critical. So what we want to discuss with you in our session is what are the best concepts we know about this half Earth, or about these 30% of conservation of Earth's land and seaside to hold the biodiversity losses. But of course, we have these geopolitical conflicts, and we perceive as scientists, as critical scientists, that the value of biodiversity and also of climate change protection is something that seems to lose in society in value and in perception. So we have to ask also, are there other opportunities, integrated land management, that we could use to have a higher acceptance of the landowners to contribute to nature conservation? For this session, we have two wonderful speakers, and I'm very glad that we could invite you and ask you to give us some thesis, some key messages. It's Professor Teja Tscharntke from the University of Göttingen. He's professor of agroecology there since 1993. I was impressed. You have also done your master in sociology and biology. So I think you are at the right place to understand these really critical questions of social ecological systems. You're a highly cited researcher since 2015, and your focus is on landscape perspectives, on biodiversity patterns, and associated ecosystem services in the temperate, but also in tropical regions. An emphasis is on biological pest control, pollination, and quantitative food webs, and of course on interdisciplinary studies. You received a lot of prizes. I hope it is okay that I do not mention all of them, but I think you are a really highly recognized researcher, and we are glad to welcome you. Before I move to your presentation, I also want to welcome Professor Markus Fischer. He's professor of plant ecology at the University of Bern since 2007. I was also impressed. You hold also a master in physics and then moved to biology. This is really something which is definitively exceptional and also interesting what it means for interdisciplinary science. You're also a highly cited researcher since 2016, and your research is on the causes and consequences of biodiversity change, with an emphasis on population ecology of rare and invasive species, on conservation biology, and particularly, I think many of us know you from the IPBES work that you did so wonderfully. You did a lot on the science policy work, and actually you're also a member of the IPBES multidisciplinary expert panel, but also at the same time leader of the German Biodiversity Exploratories and the Swiss National Research Program on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I think the expectations are extremely high, considering your thesis, your inputs into the discussion, what to do better. And I want to start with you, dear Teja Tscharntke, with mixing land sparing with land sharing.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and also for inviting me to give my let's say my arguments on this interesting topic, which has a long-standing history. As you may all know, it's for a discussion over decades, but still it addresses very, very central points in conservation and biodiversity conservation. And recently there was a publication by Ian Bateman and Andrew Balfour in Nature, and they again took the position, as several people from the UK take the position that land sparing is a main point, and the EU policy should give up all these lots of land sharing positions. So what is land sharing? What land sparing? I just wrote it down here. Land sharing is the integration of production and conservation on the same land, for example, by organic farming, whereas land sparing makes the argument that it is better to segregate high intensity food production, so to further intensify and to get more free land to use it as a reserve for highly protected species. And we recently wrote also this year this kind of response to this Bateman and Baumford paper in Trends of Ecology and Evolution. So I'm more or less recently was very much involved in this discussion, and I organized my message into 3 key messages. The first one is that we need to prioritize maintaining and restoring natural habitat globally, which is important. And the second point is that organic farming is not the overarching win-win-win solution, which is often claimed by in politics. And the third point is that we need to promote landscape connectivity across farmed and natural land. So this kind of land sharing position. First, the first point is to prioritize natural habitat globally. The simple reason is that the great majority of all species needs natural land. I will illustrate this point by pollinators, especially by bees. You know, pollinators are important for crop pollination, so provide major ecosystem services. But on the other hand, for crop pollination, there's only a few bees involved. Only 12.6% of all bee species globally, these are about 20,000 species, have been found on crops. Only 2% contribute to less than 5% or to more than 5% of crop flower visitation. This shows that the conservation of even of pollinators as main actors also in agroecosystems needs an explicit focus on natural land. The second point that I want to make here is that the bigger the better philosophy, the traditional is kind of gone, that it needs both small and large blocks in oh my goodness, small and large blocks of natural land. You can't stick only to big ones. There's this old sloth discussion, whether it's better to have single large or several small blocks. And increasingly, it's clear that the amount of habitat per landscape is important. So it's also very much important to keep also the small blocks in our landscape, which plays a big role, and not to devaluate these small pieces of land, like small forest forest blocks, let's say, or abandoned land, and so forth. The second point is that organic farming is not the overarching win-win-win solution. So the claim is that organic farming is good for biodiversity, for productivity, and human wealth. I will come to this in the next slide. And the EU Green Deal, as you all know, means that we have 25 organic farming until 2030. Now we have less than 10%. But the question is that what is it about organic farming? It's a banning of all synthetic agrochemicals. Is this a solution? You know, agricultural intensification, it's said here, is not only about synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. It's also about only few crop species which are planted, which reduce heterogeneity. It's about large fields. It's about monocultures. It's about semi-natural habitat loss. It's about the overall homogenization of landscape. All these points are not addressed by certification of EU organic farming. And this is a problem. That it is not the main target of organic farming to increase biodiversity. Why is this a problem in organic farming? You have an increase by 1/3 of species when you count this in organic compared to conventional fields per area. But when you take into account the yield, this is no longer the case because yields are on average reduced by 19 to 25%. And when you have a cereal field, your productivity or your yield in the end can be even halved. That's one point. It's an important shortcoming of organic farming. The second point is that organic food is not per se healthier. It is a diet. It's a correct diet, and even Osnigli, the famous former president of FEdA in Switzerland, also argued in this way. The third point is that pesticide use, or that organic farming does not use pesticide, is still a myth, because natural pesticides are allowed, for example, copper agents. And when you buy your apple or your organic wine, organic apple, organic wine in the supermarket, these are sprayed maybe 20% less than conventional food. So they are, in short, highly sprayed usually. And to keep in mind, and this is shown by the photos on top, usually you think of a very organic, idyllic organic farm as it's shown under A, but you can also have organic farming like under B with huge monocultures, 20, 30 hectare large fields, which also, of course, do not much contribute to biodiversity. Lots of organic farms, this is number C, is grown under plastic in or greenhouses like in the Netherlands. And then on the bottom right, D, we have whole landscapes covered by plastic, like in Andalusia, especially in the Almeria region. And 10-15% of these products, so sweet pepper, zucchini, eggplants, etc., which are organically produced under these plastic sheets, and of course in a way that is destroying landscapes. What we need higher landscape heterogeneity, and we need something what is not covered by organic farming. We need something like 20% semi-natural habitat, which is a very well-founded threshold. Meanwhile, you need a much higher crop diversity, long crop rotations. You need small fields with long edges. For example, when you have landscapes with small fields and long edges, you can have a 5-fold increase of wild bees. You can have 6-fold increase in multi-diversity of many groups. So much more than you ever would get with organic farming. Nothing to say organic farming, but it is not the final solution of biodiversity losses. Last point is promotion of landscape connectivity across farmed and natural land. Landscape connectivity is key in landscape to reduce extinctions. It has to involve farmed and as well as natural land. And in agricultural landscape, you have also to keep in mind that we have in Europe a long history of human land use. So you have a lot of popular and endangered species like hare, hamster, white stork. We have a lot of arable wheat species. It's a vegetation type which is highly endangered. Meanwhile, you have really a hard time to find rare arable wheat species in our landscapes. So here a few. You're on the second point to keep this connectivity and this connection of farms and natural land is also that a lot of Ecosystems are provided by the species, pollinators. I mentioned these already. Natural enemies are also very important. When you exclude natural enemies, here on the bottom left, for example, in cereal fields, you see that you have a much higher aphid density, triple higher cereal aphid density. When you exclude bats and birds here on bottom right, from cacao, you have a half of the productivity compared to a situation where bats and birds have excess. So what does it mean when you start here in this schematic overview? On the left with yellow, you have the, let's say, cereal fields. Green are your natural land. You can go the traditional way. You have more natural habitat to increase biodiversity. You can have wildlife friendly practices with organic farming in the middle, or you can go for smaller fields and you can go for higher crop diversity. So smaller fields, higher crop diversity means higher crop heterogeneity. When you take all together, you have a mix which makes our landscape much more interesting in terms of biodiversity conservation. So when you have reduced yields, there's another problem that you may have a need to even more import food from the outside. The EU is a major have major food imports from and exports. Also Germany, we depend on lots of imports, and when you have a lower yields, of course, that means that you have possibly less controlled food imports from countries with very high biodiversity on the field. So you need to cope with that. Another point is that land sparing. An argument against land sparing is that high intensity farming does not automatically lead that you have natural land set aside. You have rebound effects, and on a global scale, it's well shown that when you have a higher intensification, this is attracting people from the outside, and people try to make more money, and that you have even more intensity of farming in your landscape or in your country. So this is a short summary. We need maintaining and restoring natural habitat globally. We need a high biodiversity shaped by agriculture for millennia. It's also because of the emotional bonding with man-made nature by people. General species in a land sharing scenario provide also important ecosystem services. And what we need is 20% semi-natural habitat, crop diversification, and field site reductions. And last not least, high socio-ecological standards for imported products. So it's very important to still keep the supply chain law and not give it up, as even the Green Party said recently. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think this already delivers us a lot of interesting questions to discuss, because precise farming, precise agriculture might only be feasible in larger blocks and is known to, for instance, contribute better to water cycles, climate protection, and so on. But I want to keep the questions that we have collected so far, and I want to overhand now to Markus Fischer with the title Thriving Landscapes, and it was interesting for me. I looked at DeepL, Thriving, Flourishing Landscapes, which is deeply connected with a very renowned politician in Germany. So I'm very interested how you interpret these thriving landscapes and gives us maybe an idea how to develop them.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks a lot for the invite. Also, thanks a lot to Teja for introducing the issue so nicely and so competently. Yeah, I mean, it really made me think this land sparing versus land sharing, and the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable actually I got with it, because to me that just didn't seem like the most important dichotomy, or maybe even a false dichotomy in a way. And I would also agree with Thea actually that in the end, mixing these two approaches, or if there are approaches at all, is probably good. So what I thought is, even the question of food production versus conservation is maybe a little bit too short-sighted if it's not embedded in a broader sustainability vision. And so I thought along the lines of what trends are we actually having, what other frame conditions do we need to consider, what are scenarios, possibly visions for the future, and how can we get there? And obviously this thriving landscape, maybe not in the Helmut Kohl sense of the meaning of the term that Christine was alluding to, but landscapes where both nature and people can thrive could be a vision. So what are the trends that we are observing? And I'm here giving my opinion, so it's more like an assessment type of talk that I'm giving, not going into individual studies. So locally and globally, biodiversity is declining, and so are almost all ecosystem services in their supply. Food production has increased a lot over the last decades, but not necessarily in a sustainable fashion. And we have climate change, which is affecting both land use and, of course, biodiversity dynamics. Here from our Europe, Central Asia assessment across all the ecosystem types, past and present changes, you can see biodiversity decline all over the board. Reasons, intense land use, agriculture, but also forestry and others, pollution, and climate change, as mentioned. These are the direct drivers underpinned by societal drivers. Now, if we look at the trends in ecosystem service supply, and let me tell you, I rather like the nature contributions to people notion, but there's not so much literature out on that yet, so I remain with the ecosystem service notion. You can see that trends over the last decades show declines almost everywhere except in food production, energy plant production, and material, including timber production. Or in other words, we have emphasized and promoted that food production so much that it came at the compromise of biodiversity and everything else. And it's maybe not so smart given the large value of ecosystem services, not only, but also in economic terms. For example, colleagues from the Americas said it's the total GDP of the Americas is exactly the same magnitude as the total value of economic value of ecosystem services there. We also need to consider that both ecosystem service supply, or biocapacity as it's called in the footprint framework, is very heterogeneously distributed, and so is actually our demand or our footprint, which gives rise to a lot of, well, injustice and negotiation questions. Half of our footprint of Central Europe is actually abroad. Now, in addition to these trends or observations, there's further facts, maybe here more on nature. Biodiversity underpins ecosystem service supply, and also biodiversity is required at different scales to provide the supply at a particular place. I also want to emphasize that ecosystem service supply is sometimes place dependent. For example, if you want a shade tree in front of the home of an elderly people, then it has just to be right in front of the home to protect them. But if you want to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you can do it anywhere. And I think there is agreement that we need at least 30% of land and sea area to maintain biodiversity and also ecosystem supply of many great deal of ecosystem service supply. Of course, there has been discussions around that. some 10 years ago for Switzerland, our number was 32%. E.O. Wilson, half Earth, there's still discussions, but I think what we can all agree on is that we have way too little, not enough currently, so we need to increase these areas, whether in protected fashion or in other conservation fashion. That's another question. Further facts to be considered from the social point of view. Yeah, several human well-being criteria need to be met. So it's economic security, physical security, health, social aspects. We have a number of perspectives, including, of course, indigenous and local perspectives, number of values, and how we deal with nature, whether it's for nature, for people, or whether we consider nature and people, or all of the above. That is all to be considered. And we have different economic thinking. On the one hand, we have ideas of systemic, synergistic, just economic thinking, and we have more profit-oriented economic thinking with externalized environmental and social costs. Also, we need to consider context dependence. We have cultural landscapes, as mentioned by Teja, where maybe land sharing makes more sense. We have natural landscapes where maybe land sparing comes more to mind. We have more or less fertile areas, which are maybe more prone to agricultural use than others. We have biodiversity hotspots and global and regional and national ecosystem service commons, for example, the Amazon, which are maybe deserve a special attention. We have different parts of the world where we have subsistence agriculture now, maybe that needs to be intensified with some inputs. Where we have industrialized agriculture, maybe we rather need to extensify, go into the agro-ecology direction, sensu FAO. And of course, we have a context dependence in terms of local and regional cultures and perspectives. So what are scenarios actually, given all that? One, it's clear from the literature that business as usual is not an option in terms of food production, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of ecosystem service supply, in terms of sustainability, and only scenarios, socioeconomic scenarios that really emphasize sustainability are an option, and they have to be diverse. So only carbon-oriented sustainability scenarios would also not do the job. I don't consider land sharing and land sparing actually as scenarios in themselves, and definitely not as visions, but they are rather outcomes of different social ecological scenarios. There are maybe some extremes as outcomes in the landscapes, but I don't think they are so ultra helpful in a way as concepts. So what could visions be actually? I would think that this term of thriving spaces where both nature and people are flourishing or thriving is a good idea. Now, of course, you will ask, what does it mean in terms of what our areas should look like? And I would agree that networks of natural areas, of restored areas, and corridors between them are what we need. And they, of course, need to cover at least 30% of the area, need to cover diverse environmental conditions to harbor the biodiversity that is to be maintained. And they need to be embedded in landscapes, the further 70%, which are also sustainably used. And only a network can be climate change proof. Everything is changing. I mean, if you have a fixed spared reserve now somewhere with climate change, the conditions will change. We cannot maintain biodiversity there anyway. So we need these networks. Food systems need to go more sustainable, both on the production side of things, but of course also on the consumption side of things in terms of diet and so forth, and in terms of food waste and in terms of the distribution of foods and the pricing and so forth. That brings me to regulations. Currently, environmental and social costs of agriculture, but also of other practices, are externalized still to a large degree. And we need regulations which balance these costs, take them into account. and they are not there in place. And of course, we want to have thriving people in terms of well-being, happy, healthy, and with access to the ecosystem services they need. Well, how can we get there? It requires transformative change. I refer to here to the IPBES global assessment, which comes up with a number of ideas how to actually bring that into being. I would also think that multilateral frameworks like the Global Biodiversity Framework, regional like the EU, and national frameworks like national strategies and so should be much more synergistic and not so antagonistic as they currently are very often. I would argue that at several spatial scales, integrated landscape approaches where you have the various stakeholders, local, regional, and also telecoupled ones, come together, negotiate what is actually the way how to manage biodiversity and food production and other ecosystem services is actually good if it's in a solidaric way, in a trust way, in an inclusive way. So why is there not so much progress towards this framework? I think the framework is actually to be applauded in the sense that it also makes more emphasis on implementation than earlier frameworks, than the Aichi targets, for example. But it's exactly there in the implementation, in the money invested, in agreeing on the monitoring framework, where we're now a little bit stuck. But that is simply because transformative change is not happening. So I want to acknowledge for all of these thoughts, and I was told to be provocative. So I hope I was to some degree. I want to thank the Senate Commission on Biodiversity of the DFG, colleagues in Switzerland in the Forum Biodiversity, colleagues in the Advisory Council of the German Government on Global Change, in IPBES, in the Biodiversity Exploratories, and in this Swiss National Research Program for stimulating discussions and stimulating my thoughts. And I'm looking forward to our discussion. And I want to advertise IPBES assessments and also these land assessments of the WBGU.
My warmest thanks. I think both talks gave us a lot of aspects on which we need to discuss what could be best pathways. And I think there are some also critical aspects, yeah, when we think on the question if land sparing and land sharing are no good scenarios, what could be better scenarios? What is the scale of these scenarios? How to get people involved? We have now a number of questions in the tool, and I want to start with one from, I hope it is okay that I call your name Nadja Simons, it's not anonymous. She wants to start with a question to Teja. She says, I agree that the EU label for organic farming is not supporting landscape heterogeneity and the other changes you mentioned. How about other labels which have more restrictions and support a more holistic approach to sustainable farming, including crop variety? Can they play a role in preserving biodiversity? And Julian Tafner added, or should the mentioned changes be included in the EU label?
Yeah. Thank you, Christine, for these questions and the audience. Yes, of course, I fully agree with Markus that the situation is complex and many aspects need to be considered from the social and economic and ecological side. Nevertheless, I think it's also good to go to point to certain concrete aspects. And one concrete aspect is that all discussions or the major pathway of discussions go in the direction of organic farming. So the Green Party in Germany, the EU with the Green Deal, they more or less argue that with this alternative type of agriculture, we have found the solution. And this is definitely not the case. So we still have to reconsider that, in particular when it comes to biodiversity conservation. And not all organizations are, or some organizations go beyond the EU label. For example, Bioland also had included these days also a point scheme to expect also contributions to biodiversity. This is a step in the right directions. Possibly Demeter too, but Demeter is for me definitely not a choice because of this esoteric and mystic background, which as a scientist we should not support. It's my feeling. But anyway, my suggestions were also to include in what kind of certification ever also things like protecting natural land on your farm, also in the tropics. I think I talk about agricultural landscapes in the tropics, not about conservation of the Amazon and so forth. So, but about agricultural landscape to keep let's say 10% on your farm and to make a certification point out of that, or to increase crop diversity. So crop rotation is only 50% longer in organic farming globally compared to conventional farming. So it's also an illusion that this is almost richer. It's not. Everybody thinks of organic farms like these traditional farms with a farm gate and the selling of products and very enthusiastic farmer, but this is no longer the case. It's also in organic farming, it's about intensification and trying to make as much money out of it as possible. And in short, I'm fully open. I think there are many other aspects coming down. For example, pesticide-free farming with synthetic fertilizers, which is also increasingly in Switzerland and in Germany coming in as an option with less reduction in productivity, and possibly also with an add-on in terms of targeted biodiversity conservation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's one aspect which was raised now by several participants related to this. I mean, you said organic farming is, of course, maybe not the best solution because the productivity is lower. And at the same time, we want to keep biodiversity globally. So many questions are now addressing this aspect of telecoupling. So maybe even if we in EU may come to better standards in agricultural management, biodiversity conservation, land sparing, what do you, and I want to start now with Markus Fischer, what do you think would be the impact on other countries? Would we be biodiversity friendlies and maybe the rest of the world pays off?
I would think that currently telecoupling plays, of course, a huge role. We have all flows of agricultural products, we have flows of money, and we have also flows of biodiversity destruction in a way, if you want, and they are very important. I mentioned the order of magnitude of maybe half of all the impacts. I would want to emphasize these questions of justice in that context. I would think that for many people, be it in the tropics or be it in temperate regions, actually a smaller scale agriculture would probably be beneficial to many people, but maybe not necessarily to the bigger companies or the bigger consortia. And there is, of course, a conflict. Also, the smaller scale landscapes that Teja was alluding to in their heterogeneity would also go well, I think, with that idea. And so I would think telecoupling is not to be banned completely. I would say there is also a lot of knowledge transfer, which is very useful, and so forth. But currently, it's not regulated in a fashion that would be beneficial to nature, nor necessarily to healthy diets, nor to the local people. So I think there is a lot of leeway for improvement, where at the end all the sectors could gain. Not sure whether Teja would agree with that, but at least that's my perception.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think we have a great responsibility for what we import and also what we export, for example, in terms of pesticide export. And in particular also in terms of import. So these discussions about supply chain law is very important in my view, in not only for food but for many other pieces. So to reduce childhood work, to reduce hunger wages, for example, etc., and also to get, let's say, relatively good environmentally friendly practices installed. This responsibility is many aspects. I think also from my point of view, very important. And but still, and of course, I also see that in terms of productivity, we also worked on this and published on that. We have, of course, first of all, we need to reduce animal food, so to eat less and to, because the import of feed, of animal feed, for example, plays a huge role, and food waste is in general also an important point. But still, even the productivity is important, because it makes food production more expensive. And then you see, when you look at the international markets, when, for example, corn prices are rising, you have immediately more hunger problems in many parts of the world. So the productivity in itself, which is often denied in the more conservation scene, the productivity in itself is also a point that we have to keep in mind, and which is a point that the land sparing advocates made correctly. Of course, when you have a 10-hectare cereal field and you grow it conventionally, or half of it conventionally, you have as much yield as the organic farm with 10-hectare production. So you could set aside 5 hectares of your field simply for biodiversity conservation. This is the point, and all these analyses are clearly correct, that for a direct support of biodiversity, the land sparing direction is kind of effective. Of course, you have has nothing to do with sustainable productivity on the highly intensified field, and of course, a political setting is also important. It does not mean when you are very effective on part of your field that the other part of the field is then set aside or abandoned, which is an expectation that this would be very romantic, let's say.
I think we start now the really critical discussion. I mean, you did here, you formalized the hypothesis that organic farming might not be the best solution, but small scale pattern would be good at a landscape scale to have a higher level of heterogeneity, but maybe they are too small to form a core area for some species. And now I come to a question that Volker formulated, and where I want to continue with Markus. If we could stop land use change, which we consider to be a major driver, this intensification and further sealing and so on, would you really think that 30% of conservation of the global land and sea surface would help to stop the biodiversity losses or not? What is the evidence?
Well, there's several questions in one. I would think that prioritizing biodiversity promotion or conservation in 30% of the global area would actually allow to maintain species or reduce global extinctions to natural background. I would think that's true. But as I mentioned, ecosystem service supply also depends on biodiversity, and many of the ecosystem services are place-based or local. So that means you also need biodiversity in the remaining 70%. But for these remaining 70%, of course, the 30% can serve as a source in a way to also replenish biodiversity in the remaining 70%. If you stop land use change now, that would mean that we would freeze quite intense land use in many parts of the world, or quite unsustainable use in many parts of the world. So I'm not sure whether that would actually lead to the 30% or plus that we would actually really need, nor that it would be a solution. So I think it would be more about transforming current land use in terms of the practices, in terms of their intensities. And as I had mentioned earlier, if you look at the FAO concept of agroecology, it's not just organic farming in the sense that we had been mentioning earlier. It's actually relatively broad. It also includes ecological intensification, for example, and so forth, and even some elements of precision farming, and so it's quite diverse. So if you would change land use in a form that would consider the local necessities and then select among there's at least 15 different general directions where you could go in terms of agricultural land use only, that would help. But of course we also have forestry, and we have of course also use of the sea and many other uses we are having. But maybe I leave it with that. So I'm convinced that we need at least 30% of the global area to maintain biodiversity, but at the same time also to even have a chance to maintain ecosystem service provision for everyone, even beyond this matrix. So it's not only nature for nature, these 30%, but they are actually also a prerequisite that we can provide ecosystem services elsewhere.
I pick now up the question and come back to you, dear Teja. If we come back to organic farming, it might not be a concept for family farming because it takes more place. So if we take these remaining 70%, which we need to feed the global population and also to produce enough resources, what would then be your vision? We know that precision agriculture, industrial agriculture, is sometimes much more beneficial because we can steer the use of resources, of fertilizers, of pesticides better than in these small-scale agricultural areas. So coming back to your thesis that the small-scale and heterogeneity is essential, would you change your thesis, or what would be your let me say recommendation how to manage these 70% if we take the 30% away?
I'm always open to changes, in my opinion. No question. Yeah, you're right. Precision agriculture is a big promise, and it needs large fields as it planned now. But on the other hand, of course, you could also imagine with a different machinery and a different approach, it could also be used to, let's say, to deal with mosaic landscapes. And definitely for species, for let's say dispersal of species in a landscape, also across landscapes, this small scale nature plays a big role, independent of whether it's conventional or organics. It shows, meanwhile, several studies. And another big point is you can keep the productivity in small scale agriculture as well as in large scale. There is no reduction. There is no need for a reduction in productivity. And the same is true also for crop diversity. Also many, let's say, agronomists tell you that you can increase the crop cycle and include many other crops, which makes a huge increase also in heterogeneity, which also means, and there are also meanwhile several meta-analyses, that in general this keeps productivity or is even means even higher yields. So these two steps, different to current organic farming, do not go not along with a reduction of yield, which is an important point. When you come, you said, Christine, with the 70% land use area, and I fully agree, this agreement on 30% protected area is a big step forward. But we have these 70% still that need to be still productive. Why are we doing agriculture? We are doing agriculture to produce food in the end, and of course we should do it in a way that it is most effective and most efficient, and of course also sustainable. And so there's no simple solution, clearly, but I think it's important to reconsider what is important and what is less important. And for example, is it really important to differentiate between natural pesticides and synthetic pesticides? When we go in the pharmacy, we also do not want to have a plant-based medicine. We go also for synthetic medicine, and there's no. It's simply, in my view, an esoteric decision based on these origin in the around 1900 and so forth. So you can also reconsider what would be best from all parts of a sustainable point of view.
Yeah, thank you. I think we all understand there is no easy solution. Mm-hmm. For saying, okay, what is better if we take these 30% as granted? There might be also landowners who say, okay, it's my land, I want to decide on my own. And this leads me to a question again to Markus. I mean, if we say, okay, we have these 30% and we need to manage somehow these 70% additionally to have a combination between land sharing and land sparing. What is your perception about the payments for ecosystem services? This is a question of Volker again. Would this promote to share land on these remaining 70%, or should this be more invested to conserve 30% of the earth and seascape?
Thank you. First on the 30 and 70%, I would think that 30% are not all protected areas. They are protected areas or other area-based conservation measures which are effective. And especially in cultural landscapes, that can actually even entail some land use. Maybe in other parts of the world it's a little bit different. And I would think in conservation, you would both have sparing and sharing elements in the sense of larger areas, as Teja mentioned, but also smaller areas and corridors, which would be more like sharing, and the large areas maybe more like sparing. And the same you would have for the 70%, just from an agricultural point of view, where you would also have some sparing elements and some sharing elements. Now, concerning this payment for ecosystem services, I mean, what is happening now is that we have very much promoted the marketable ecosystem services, the material ones, as I mentioned, agricultural, timber, energy plants, at the expense of the regulating and the non-material ecosystem services. And there is an issue. I think there is a regulation issue. You could also say we are entrusting land to farmers, to foresters, to others, and the land can provide us with 18 different categories of ecosystem services. So if people only provide one category, for example, food, we still have to think the other 17. And if the cost, or if the benefit of producing the one is smaller than the cost of reducing all the others, then there needs to be some compensation, and that can either be subsidies where farmers, for example, are subsidized for more environmentally friendly practices, or it can be via some pricing payment for ecosystem services, something it can be with the consumer prices and so forth. But currently, I would argue that most of the environmental costs are still externalized, despite quite some progress, which is very good. But we are not there. But I wouldn't think that payment for ecosystem services would be the one-size-fits-all solution. Could be part of a wider regulation issue, and of course also these value chains and tariff questions and so forth are also, of course, are important in that respect.
Thank you so much. I think I come back to one aspect that you both mentioned, and these are the sustainable food chains. And there's one question from the auditorium, Mr. Unestal from UBA. It's what can we do additionally to managing land use more sustainably? And he mentions that food waste, and often we produce too much or we do not consume such much, is still not used for animal feeding anymore. He's asking, what do you think about changing this regulation, and why is it not changed so far? Maybe I come back to you, Teja.
Yeah, food waste is definitely a huge problem, no question. But it has also to do with our wealth. Let's say, when people go into the supermarket, they want to have not what a wilted legume or whatsoever, or they don't want to have in pathogen infected apples. They want to have clean apples, or they select this. So it's mainly, as we do with other products, we go for the best and for the cheapest part, and only a relatively small portion of the population considers this in much more detail. So I'm not so super optimistic that food waste in the retail and household on a household level will be very much reduced in the future. It needs more regulation. I think there are many options that you can regulate over taxes, for example, and for example, meat consumption and many other things. But I think reducing meat consumption is a much better way forward, I would say, or to make it more expensive and to reduce it. Then you would also get a lot of area free for different kinds of productivity. I fully agree. There's no one way out, and it's a complex way. And you see, when you look at politics, also in our countries, how small these steps forward are to change systems. You also have, of course, to keep in mind that farmers need to live from what they are producing. Of course, no reason to blame them for what they are doing. Everybody want to make the money to live from that. So but it still needs, of course, regulation. It needs incentives, and it needs compensation for certain things. And it's more a question of the priorities, in which direction they go. And these were my favorites. So I'm very much in favor of very efficient food chain law, for example. This would also help farmers here, because it would immediately raise the costs of imported products, and I would very much go into making meat and sausages, German sausages, much more expensive. And this would be, for example, two easygoing ways forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We are coming now to the end of our session, because I think most are looking forward to also to a little coffee break. But let me resume only very shortly. I think, and you were not so consentful as originally expected. I think what we learned is sharing and sparing are synergistic concepts. We need to take both of them. We have to combine them with much more interdisciplinary approaches when it comes to a systemic point of view, to combine also the global and the local point of view. I learned, and in Christmas times, this might be very difficult, that sausages must be more expensive. I'm really sad about not eating a bratwurst anymore. No, but I think what we learned is also that these questions or these messages for policymakers must not necessarily be only how to optimize the land use, but really how to connect systems and subsystems in a meaningful way, so that we consider particularly the food chains and the ecosystem services that people want to take from a local and from a also global perspective. This is, I think, what we learned from your very interesting presentations and also discussion. I made many more notes, but I think the organizers of the conference will kill me if I speak longer. I want to thank you warmly